Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this rainy, horrible, muggy day. I know I was a little afraid of the possibility of another flood, but I'm glad that that's not going to be happening. So we think. I'm Gia Gonzalez. I'm the managing editor at Nightboat Books. I'm really excited to be here joining you in person and virtually for a reading with Larissa Pham and Aurora. For those of you who are joining us online, there is a link on Zoom, I believe, where you can donate to Segue, and I encourage you to check it out. And for those of you here in person, don't forget to check out the merch table, where we'll be selling copies of the author's books and our very popular limited edition Faggots and Their Friends tote bags. So we have a few people to thank before we start tonight's reading, which is the first reading of the Segue reading series this year. I'd like to thank James Sherry for the invitation to curate the season again with Nightboat Books. Thank you to Lonely Christopher, the Segue Foundation at large, Artist Space, my coworkers and co-curators at Nightboat Books, including Lena Bergamini, who will be introducing our second reader, Aurora. So I'll speak just a little bit about Nightboat Books in case you're not familiar with us, and some of our upcoming events before I introduce Larissa, who will be our first reader of the evening. Nightboat Books is a nonprofit book publisher of provocative works of experimental poetry and prose based in Brooklyn. I ran over here from the subway, I'm sorry. We are thrilled to be collaboratively curating the season of the Segue reading series, which we'll be doing through November 18th. Next week at Segue, we will be joined by Saray Jarrell Johnson and Eric Sneathan, and we would love to have you join us again. So now I will introduce our first reader of the night, Larissa Pham. I'm in a gaudy, crumbling, mansion-like building in Ridgewood, occasionally rented out for quinceañeras, wearing a skimpy, haphazard arrangement of silk scarves in my closet I thought might be a look. Jostled from one, bare, sweat slicked back to another, I don't know what time it is or how long I've been in this place. I'm trying to keep pace with the thudding, industrial bass line when suddenly it fades out to reveal the incongruous, clear, high, breathy tones of Donna Summer's voice. I love to love you, baby. This isn't the radio edit. We're talking the entire 16-minute unabridged cut. This version of the song is a slow burn with a sure beat, building slowly to a rapturous, delirious choral arrangement at the 12-minute mark. High on soprano timbres, totally subsumed by the song's melodrama, the joyful and chaotic hedonism of the crowd, I feel like I'm in gay heaven. I feel like I could stay in this moment forever. Okay, sure, this is the stuff of cliches. Written out on the page, my moment of reverie withers into something feeble, trite, overwrought, but the feeling was so real. Even to insist on that, the moment's splendor feels lame. Maybe you had to be there. Still, I recall the moment in a bright prism of memory I hold close. It's always seemed so unfair to me that I could write paragraphs and paragraphs, and yet all that could be felled by a song, Pham writes in her most recent title, Pop Song, a collection of essays released by Catapult in the spring of 2021. Writing to me seems to be a kind of play acting, a gesture that dances around the feeling which cannot be held in words. I just want to make you feel. This is what Larissa Pham's work does for me. It puts its lips to that immense wellspring of feeling that characterizes cliché and from it drinks greedily. Her work reminds me that maybe things are cliché for a reason. Sometimes, reading from pop song, I'd encounter a scene so vulnerable and exquisite in its passions that it hurt to look at. I'd like to stress that what I felt wasn't embarrassment, not of the condescending second-hand variety anyway, so much as it was a kind of recognition, an involuntary recoiling, an attempt to shield the tenderest, most feeling parts of myself. Pop song revels in the most desperate realms of love, sublimity, and pain, where feeling becomes a vehicle for transcendence. Following that sensation where it leads her, from the paintings of Agnes Martin, the poetry of Anne Carson, the photography of Nan Goldin, and of course, her own romantic life, I have been so grateful for Pop Song's invitation for us to join in this journey. Please welcome Larissa Pham.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I really thought it was just going to be like a bio. I'm so moved. It feels so meaningful to be read so closely and to have met like such a perfect reader, and to get to read to such a perfect room. I think if I put my water bottle like this is like, I don't know, I'm going to put the lid back on. I'm not reading from Pop Song today. I'm going to read from some new fiction that I've been working on. Okay, let's see. It's an excerpt from a novel. All you need to know is that the narrator is a woman on book tour for a novel that is in part a revenge fantasy based on an incident in her own life. And she's meeting up with a college friend named Frances. Earlier on this book tour, she received an email that said, "That's not how I remember it." In the novel, I killed him. In the novel. In the novel, the narrator, who is based on me, kills the man, the older man, the artist, the old painter, who is more or less a professor I once had, altering some biographical details. I had not set out to write a scene of such violence. What I had set out to do was describe in emotionally, if not factually true terms, what had happened. The text itself elided the act of the killing, but the scene remained violent. After I wrote it, I realized the book couldn't end any other way. When I was trying to sell the novel, some editors remarked that they had been surprised by my narrator's decision. Sure, it makes sense, one editor said, but it feels unearned. I just don't know if this character would really have the fortitude to do such a thing. It was noon. I had arrived in Los Angeles early that morning, catching the first flight out of Portland after my reading. My friend Ellie had texted me to see how I was doing, and I told them I was okay. Going to LA next, I typed, "I think I'm going to see Frances, here for a couple days." I never read from the part where I killed him, or rather from the part in which I, that is, she, the character, has a confrontation with him, and after which it is implied that he is dead. I preferred to read from a scene near the beginning of the book, a scene that starts with a narrator in her studio. She's immersed in her work, preparing the surface of a canvas. In writing the scene, I had lingered on the process, devoting pages to the repetitive, soothing motions of polishing the surface clean. After the canvas is prepared, she stands at the easel, brush in hand, preparing to make the first mark. Her hand hovers above the canvas, the brush tip flexible, trembling, honest, ready. Then the old painter walks in, and her life changes. That part was true. My life did change. My phone buzzed, and it was Frances. "Sorry, I'm running late," she said. We had had plans to meet for lunch and then go to a few galleries on the west side, where she was in a group show. At one point in our friendship, I would have stayed with her on a trip such as this, but I wasn't certain where we stood now. Frances had been a classmate of mine and a painter, too. She and I met freshman year in the early morning section of an introductory drawing class. My style tended toward the gestural and charcoal. Frances's was precise, usually rendered in graphite, with thin, exact lines. For the next 4 years, Frances and I were in studio together, side by side. Nearly every instructor we worked with tried to break her of her style, but she never gave in. There was something vaguely racist about the way they spoke to her, that her work was too clean, too blank, too serene. Of course, the paintings were formally good, but they were hermetic, instructors complained, repetitive, unfashionable, even. Still, everyone acknowledged what a talent she was. No one could paint like Frances. That was why it was so galling that she continued to paint the way she did. When her classmates began to experiment with overtly conceptual work, Frances remained stubbornly devoted to her subject, faintly neutered paintings of Asian women holding props in unusual situations. A woman sitting on a bed holding a water-filled bag with a goldfish in it. A girl wearing a school uniform cutting off another girl's dark braid with a long-handled pair of gardening shears. It had never occurred to me when we first met that people would compare us. Of course, they did. To an outsider, we were alike enough that our differences could be elided, but between us, all we saw were our differences. I was messy and Frances was neat. I wore my hair down and she wore hers in a bun. I dated around and Frances had been with the same person since high school. I changed my subject over and over, and Frances continued to paint the same thing. No, I had given up painting altogether, and Frances was still painting. My phone buzzed again. Be there in 15. Will you get us a table? Slowly, without any rush or commotion, I began to pack up my things. Once, Frances had called me in the middle of the night, nearly in tears, asking if I would help her get a bird out of her apartment. I had been at a party, but I answered the phone, showed up a little tipsy and carrying half a bottle of wine. At first, I couldn't find the bird, but then we heard it, the frantic flutter of its wings, and I chased it around Frances's apartment while she giggled helplessly behind a mug full of Sauvignon Blanc. It was small, some kind of gray and brown sparrow, and it kept eluding my grasp, and finally we were reduced to looking up some removal online. One website advised turning out every electric light and opening a window. The lighter, different category of darkness from outside, the velvet smell of the air, the freshness of the leafing trees would draw the bird out, so the website promised. We were skeptical, but we did as instructed, and within a minute, maybe two, the bird sailed out of the window and into the night. Frances pulled the window shut, and we hugged each other, triumphant. It would have been nice if that moment had brought us closer together. If I had stayed, if she had asked me to stay, if we had sat on the floor together, talking. But I went back to the party not long after, and Frances kept doing whatever she had been doing in her room. Once, Frances had asked me to model for her. We reserved a classroom and locked the door, and I stripped and stood where she asked me to. Then she studied my naked body in a matter-of-fact, clinical way. She had a list of poses she wanted, which I understood would be references for her paintings. We didn't talk much, except for when she asked me to adjust something, the tilt of my hip, the position of my hand. Each time I changed position, she asked if I was comfortable, and she worked quickly, using only rudimentary shading. In the finished work that resulted from the drawing session, her figures looked solid, jointed, like they would cast shadows. I became a woman reclining on an analyst's couch, a woman crouching underwater, two women holding each other by the shoulders. I couldn't recall doing that pose. I wouldn't have been able to hold it for long enough for her to draw me like that, not without a place to rest my hands. But I recognized the shape of the torso beneath the clothes, and I knew anyone who knew me would see it too. I didn't know when Frances had had time to memorize my body. Did she learn it all in that instant, or had she always been watching? Excuse me. Excuse me. At lunch, we split the bill. In the car, she wanted to know how I became a writer. The real story, she said. Tell me everything. It's not that interesting, I said, but I did tell her, at least in terms of what one would call a career, how it happened. In the novel, there was no possibility of love. In the novel, there was no possibility of forgiveness. And as there was no possibility of forgiveness, there was no need for reconnection or communication or even acknowledgement that someone else in the world knew what had happened. My story had become, in my mind, the only story there was. The narrative, which I had maintained for nearly 10 years now, was that I had had to make him a villain in order to move on with my life. Writing the book had felt necessary, like an exorcism. It had started close to truth and then diverged broadly from fact at distinct points. I made the gap in the characters' ages larger, made the old painter crueler, made myself, the protagonist, prouder and with more artistic potential to lose. At a certain point, the book stopped being an exorcism and became a project of craft and form. Then I grew totally absorbed in the writing, in the tuning and pitching, bleaching it into narrative. But it had always come from life. The life it came from was mine. So why was it that I seemed to have forgotten he was a real person at all? I thought about the email again. That's not how I remember it. He knew then that there was a version of me that killed him. Frances's painting in the group show hung opposite an Alex Katz's. It was a departure for her in that it featured 3 figures, where usually in her work, the women stood alone or in pairs. A girl lay on the ground, her body translucent. Another girl crouched over her, her hands cupping either side of her head. A third stood at her feet, looking down at the other 2 figures. All 3 of the figures had long, dark hair, the darkest parts of the painting. As in most of Frances's paintings, the figures loosely floated in space against a light pastel ground that suggested neither interior nor exterior, but a third dream field. The painting was beautiful, as in the technicality of it, the action of it, the way the strokes had been laid down. Looking at her work, I thought of light and how it moved, and how the figures, especially the translucent one, seemed to glow. It was beautiful to look at, and I told Frances as much. "Thanks," she said. "It was fun to paint." She had been curious about how it would feel to paint a translucent figure and wondered if she could pull it off. Did I notice? She pointed to a part of the canvas. There was some white mixed in, those little kinetic strokes, to give it the sense of being made of light and not just a transparent, solid object. "Yes," I said. "I did notice that." "It took me a while to figure out," Frances said. "That's something I love about painting. There are some things that are easy and I do them all the time. And there are things that are hard that I try to do. And there are things that are hard that I'll never do again." "Was this easy or was it hard?" I asked her. "It was appropriately hard," she said. "I want to do it again." As much as I admired it, I had always been simultaneously perplexed and intrigued by Frances's work. It never changed. She always painted women, and always the same kind of woman, Asian like us, with thick, dark hair. The tenor of the paintings was always the same, too, a kind of quiet, hermetic mysticism edged here and there by the presence of some cultural symbol that gave the work a slight jaggedness while flirting on the edge of Orientalism. I had never liked that in college. Some of her figures wore Japanese schoolgirl uniforms. It felt too easy and appropriative in a weird way, as if she were banking on the fact that to white people, we all looked the same no matter where we were actually from. The racial discomfort was part of the work. Viewers were drawn in, then repelled, confused as to who was actually being tokenized and whether the desire they felt was coming from a mockery of that desire or if it was in fact earned. But in the larger scheme of things, the painting sold well, very well, probably at least precisely because of the perceptions of Asian women Frances continued to evoke. And I wondered, frequently, what she actually thought about it all. Was gaming the system by enacting the stereotype really gaming anything at all? I didn't think most collectors were wise enough to know that they were being played, and I wasn't convinced that Frances thought she was actually playing them. I had read her interviews and profiles when she shared them, and in them she had acknowledged these themes. Her stance was feminist insofar as painting beautiful women could be said to be feminist, and when asked, she delicately touched upon the notion of exploring and expanding depictions of Asian femininity. But she never actually said much and cultivated an air of mystery, and many of the articles about her featured photographs of her, standing straight-backed in her studio, wearing something black with an interesting silhouette, looking, as always, terribly beautiful, too. "Congratulations on the show," I said. "Thanks," she answered, but I knew it didn't register for her. that she was already moving on to what she had planned. Speaking of congratulations, she said, I read your book. I felt caught. In the same way I had never thought that the old painter would read it, it had never occurred to me that someone like Francis would read it too. Thanks, I said, and then I wasn't sure what else I wanted to say. Heat flared into my cheeks. It's good, she said, as though she had not noticed. It's really well written. It's intense, she said, and I knew that even though I had not told her anything, she knew or had inferred what had happened. Thanks, I said again. I noticed something, she said. The character you wrote never actually paints anything. She's trying to make something, but she's constantly getting interrupted. The book opens with her preparing these surfaces, and there are all these scenes set in her studio. But what does she actually make? Well, I said, the book, if you take it to be a first-person artifact. Frances glanced at me and then moved so that we were facing the same direction. I was surprised when you chose to go to that program, she said. Why? You didn't seem to take the work that seriously. I took it really seriously, I said. I feel like you saw how often I was in the studio. Not that, she said. Of course you were there all the time. You worked late. Me too. I just thought. I saw her looking for her thought, her lips slightly parted. Then she spoke again. It seemed like you could live without it, that there was something else that mattered more. It's not like making art is life or death, I said. You're not painting anymore, are you? She said, because of him. I said, that's not what happened. But that was how that door closed, and I had been the one to close it. I could have transferred to another program, could have taken a job as a studio assistant, or rented a place somewhere in the city, a place with a sink and a wall and a window, not even a window. I could have worked with artificial light, made the colors loose and strange. I had let it die instead, and in choosing to write about it, I had chosen revenge. I remembered then something else about Frances, something I hadn't thought about since we had lived in the same city. The winter of our junior year, she abruptly disappeared, stopped showing up to class, stopped answering calls and texts. 4 days after she first skipped class, I went to her apartment and knocked on the door until she answered, opening the door just a crack. The place was a mess. Dishes were stacked in the sink. The floor of her bedroom was barely visible beneath a layer of clothes and books. Let me in, I said. I can't. I'll help you, I said. I'll help you clean. No, she said. It's okay, I said. No, she said again. I'll be fine. And she closed the door again, and when I knocked some more, she didn't answer. From the street below, I could see that her lights were on, and I stood outside for a while until they turned off. The next week, Frances was back in class, her hair clean and shiny, like nothing at all had happened, and when I moved to ask her, she said, I don't want to talk about it. The next time it happened, when I went to her apartment, there was no response at all. I knew she was in there, and I knew what it looked like, and I wondered then what would have happened if I had gone in that first time, even though she had said no, if I had insisted on helping her. Would she have let me in like that, and would it have changed anything? It's okay that you're not painting, Frances said now. I wanted it to be your form, but it's not. It's something that we don't share anymore, and it's why we've drifted apart. Is it life or death to you? I said. Yeah, she said. I think it is. She turned away from me then, looking hard at the white wall. Do you ever think about how you're an animal? She said. Underneath everything, the clothes, car, job, relationships. You're supposed to do all the things an animal does, breathe, shit, fuck, eat. And you're supposed to be happy about being alive, being an animal. On a baseline, you're supposed to be glad you exist. But I can't do those things that seem to come so easily to all the other animals. Sometimes I can't move, sometimes for days. Sometimes it feels like there's a voice in my head, a distorted, fucked up voice that tells me that it'd be easier if I didn't exist. If I were truly an animal, a good animal, and sometimes I wish I were, I'd claw my own head off. But the only thing that makes it stop, the only thing that gets me up and out of my own filth is the work. If I can gesso a canvas, I have something to prepare for the next day. If I know what I'm painting, I can get out of bed. My brain turns into barbed wire if I don't work. I've learned that before. I don't want to go there again. That's what all of this is for. I watched her face, and I knew that if she looked at me, if she saw that I was listening, we would never speak again. I don't care about money, Frances said. Small tears were showing in her eyes. I don't care about being famous. Everything I do, everything I've done in my stupid little life is so I can keep painting. It doesn't matter what it is. It's not about what's in it. It's about getting to make the thing at all. If it sells, I have a career, and if I have a career, I can do this. And if I do this, I don't want to die, I said. Yeah. I wanted very badly to touch her, but I didn't. When it happened, I wanted to die, I said instead. You didn't, though. No, I said. I didn't. I believed it was fine that I had written the story that I believed to be true. The issue was that was it the only story of myself that I knew? The issue was that now that I had written it down, what else did I have to say? In the car, I felt like we'd both been crying. Frances kept sniffing and pushing her hair off her forehead. My mouth was dry, and I picked at the chapped, dead skin on my lower lip until it bled. We had agreed, more or less silently, that the gallery hopping was over, and Frances said she would drop me off at the bookstore for my event that night. As she was merging lanes, she accidentally cut off the car beside us, and at the red light, the driver pulled up alongside us and rolled down his window. Fucking chinks can't drive, he said. After a beat, her eyes on the walk signal, Frances rolled down both our windows. Her face was impassive. Fuck you, we both yelled, flinging out our hands in unison, middle fingers extended. Then the light turned green, and she accelerated, leaving him behind. I wanted to laugh, but none of it was funny. It didn't bring us closer together, but this time I hadn't thought it would. I knew this would always be how it would be with Frances. Always something jagged, this painful intimacy, both of us carrying the memory of the thing we had once shared, a language we had been fluent in but no longer spoke together. This was not the end of our friendship, I knew, but it would be like this. She parked and didn't undo her seatbelt. I opened the door and got out, then leaned back inside, one knee on the leather seat. Frances, I said. I wasn't sure what I was trying to say. Thanks for giving me a ride. Of course, she said, and she smiled a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larissa. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then feel free to check out the merch table, get a drink, use the bathroom, and we'll be back. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We're going to get started again. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be introducing Aurora. Okay. When I read an early version of The Fifth Wound by Aurora Mattia in 2020 while quarantining, I thought, this is like nothing I've read before, and also it can only be written now. Lush, cascading, circular, one can't forget that Ezekiel was reading Proust and Aurora is fascinated by what Ezekiel finds beautiful. In the same way that Proust manages to find in a dissolving memory of all the times he has awoken many circular stories from his life, Aurora, sitting with her snake, old milk around her neck, allows you to luxuriate in the very dream space where deep emotions are processed. In true Scorpio fashion, she does what many people don't want to do, but also what is most sexy, allows herself to feel all the confusing, seemingly disjointed feelings and live within them, and live them out as a fantasy or a myth. And in The Fifth Wound, she writes it all down in delirious visual detail so we too can feel all of it with her. But unlike Proust, which I have a theory you're meant to fall asleep while reading, Aurora's language draws you in with its hypnotic clarity and wakes you up in a dream world. For me, this is a book about the way that love or infatuation with another can be more telling about oneself than the other. It's a book of dreamscapes and self-mythologizing, within which there is still space for philosophizing about the modern literary landscape. This line appears twice in the book. Fantasy is not in itself ethical, but it is the means by which an ethics is made, a way of approaching meaning by excess and collage, passion and permutation. This is a work that leans into the way fantasy is a form of understanding of the self, and in that it allows space for the reader to give themselves the same generosity. Reading The Fifth Wound leaves me wanting to luxuriate in my own fantasies. Aurora.
Hi. Okay. Below me and down. Okay. So, The Fifth Wound came out in March. And yeah, I was at the airport yesterday morning and I had this open and it drew eyes. Yeah, so The Fifth Wound came out in March. I'm actually turning in the line edits back to my publisher tomorrow, supposedly, for my second book, Unsex Me Here, that's coming out September 2024. And that's a collection of short stories, some of which I wrote before The Fifth Wound and some of which were written after. And I'm really excited for that, but I'm also not reading from that. I'm reading from a new book that I have been working on called 7 Come 11, which is a gambling term, specifically craps. That you, it's a funny game name. I'm like, I hate that word, but anyway, it's what you say when you're rolling the dice. So this book is about a trans woman living in outside of Austin in the 70s, and she wants to be a singer-songwriter, a country singer-songwriter, but her singing voice is too low to be unclockable. So I just thought of Not a Soul Can Clock, if anyone knows Not a Soul Can Clock. Anyway, sorry, that's a Drag Race reference. But so she creates a secret identity as a man to sort of like be the front for her music. But she ends up getting in a couple relationships, one of which is with a woman who only knows her as the man she performs as. And so the book is kind of about like the way having a public persona ends up having implications for your personal life. So this is from the second chapter, and it's the first time she's performing as him. John Bluebonnet looked into the mirror above the porcelain sink. He held a small pair of scissors aloft in a bony, delicate hand, squinting his eyes. From his lips hung a toothpick he was troubling with his tongue. The glass was small and beginning to dull. The cuckoo, she's a pretty bird, he hummed, observing his mustache. He couldn't decide if it was lopsided, but decided it was good enough. The hummingbird was leaned against a green satin chair in the living room. This he lifted and in one swing hefted onto his lap, proceeding to tune the strings in a state of nervous focus as the sun beat through the curtains. He was not some kind of saint, unreachable and immaculate on stage. There was no eternity around him. He was as sensitive as the present instant, and the guitar knew it, as sure as a horse knows it. The Gibson had been a gift, inherited from an ex-lover named Silver, who had inherited it from his ex-lover who was dead. It wasn't really a hummingbird anymore. His ex-lover's ex-lover had retrofitted the original pickguard with strips of snakeskin, glossy and yellow. The wood was worn in places, needed a new stain, but he was hesitant to mess with what was already done because the dead were involved. It was something like respect for a love he'd never known, never seen, which was before his time and would therefore remain always a myth, but which had hung over them both, John and Silver, like a shade tree every night he spent in that man's bed up in Manhattan. The best he could do was buy a new guitar, but that wouldn't be right either. He felt a kind of duty on account of the genealogy of lovers to keep playing it. John's house was out in Spicewood off 71. He rented a kind of cottage from an old woman who lived alone on a large acreage with horses and chickens. He didn't know about horses and chickens, but he appreciated their company. The cottage was the original house behind a stand of mesquites on the far side. It had a porch and no air conditioning, a small kitchen and a clawfoot bathtub that crowded the washroom with its improbable berth. The main house, built in 1962, was an anachronistic monument of Fredericksburg limestone masonry with a full wraparound and 2 stories. A dirt path led from one domicile to the other and out to the road. It was 20-odd minutes to the gig. Jack of diamonds, he sang, quiet and absent-minded, as if he were not singing but merely listening to another man's song, as if he were staring into the campfire some other night, out back of some other dive. Oh, I've known you of old. While his truck bumped across the uneven ruts of the path. The sky was insistent and blue. Blue burned in John's eyes. There was no escaping it. He squinted up at the rear view where the chickens were grazing inside their mesh pen. The old woman rarely left her bedchamber outside of dusk and dawn. April 2nd, 1977, he thought. The day was as empty as any other. As long as there was a present, there wasn't any such thing as a future. It was always now, would always be, raw as a hot wind. No safety in what hadn't happened. Halfway to Bee Caves, he realized he was hungry. The food there wasn't much good unless Ricky was in making guacamole. John wondered if performers ate free. He'd forgot to ask. So he pulled a sharp turn, stopped into the Texaco on the corner there, and bought a refrigerated Snickers, and then, on a kind of showman's whim, some pink Pop Rocks to scatter later in his beer in case the atmosphere that night would suggest that sort of sport. At the counter, the slow and perpetual tumbling of a fried burrito upon the warm rungs of the roller grill appealed to him. One of them too, he said, nodding toward the hot food. 20 and 15 is 35, plus 15 is 50 cents, said the clerk, before turning half aside to squirt a brown stream of dip into a styrofoam cup he kept by the register, covered discreetly with a paper napkin, which he first removed and then replaced. The sight reminded John he was out. A pack of Reds, too, he said, while the clerk, his name was also John, pulled a pair of tongs from his belt, lifting with one hand the tobacco-colored burrito from the grill and into a red plaid food tray, which the other hand had slid below without his even looking down, all in a single motion whose blasé grace suggested a kind of masculine self-possession, which John watched closely in case he might learn something of it by subtle but devotional attention. 70 cents, said the man, the other John, turning now and then sliding the Marlboros across the formica. He fumbled in his pockets, then placed 2 quarters, a dime, and a nickel on the counter. Thank you, sir, he said, pausing, turning back at the door to add, I'll be playing the saloon tonight. The man stared at him for a moment, not quite blankly. He looked him up and down. John had been living out in Spicewood, coming on a year, and had never, in a sense, set foot in that Texaco. What kind of music? Just some songs with my guitar. All right, he said. Do you pick or just strum? I know a few good licks. All right, the man said again. He studied John too, this time with more curiosity, sensing vaguely a kind of disturbance in the far back of his mind, a déjà vu, something about those eyes, dull as dusk until the sun caught them. Then, all of a sudden, well, they made you think of fire opals, the kind of blue that burns and flickers with something else, some kind of wild light. What's your name? John Bluebonnet, said John. John Bluebonnet, said the man. All right. Soon he saw that hand-painted yellow billboard rising in the distance, signaling the way into the trees with thick maroon letters reading Soap Creek Saloon. His spirits rising too, momentarily dignified, singing, It's Snickers when I'm hungry, tequila when I'm dry, it's pop rocks for my party and religion when I die, as he turned up the infamous potholed excuse for a road that ran a quarter mile up to the saloon. The truck bumped and bucked, and John wondered how anyone made it up here with a hitch. When Willie's folks came, it must have been the high that guided them, because no sober man would dare it. There were a few cars and trucks parked already in the lot. The purple El Camino was Howell's. He'd been up lately doing some roof repairs after a big rain. That red truck was Billy Bob's. There's actually a man named Billy Bob who was the bouncer there, so that's not just me making up a dumb name. That red truck was Billy Bob's, and the faded green Chevy was Ricky's. As for the others, he couldn't say. The regulars, he guessed, since the show wasn't for another few hours, and no one really showed up until long after sundown, when the gigs at Armadillo and Vulcan let out, and folks filed in from Austin, and the marquee lights on that tin Lone Star nailed to Soap Creek's peaked red facade illuminated the smoke from all the joints in the lot. Little more than a jaundiced and buzzing glow, but enough to find your footing and lose your keys. John swung the hummingbird over his shoulder by its white leather strap and strolled with practiced gunsmoke swagger through the saloon doors, his eyes dazzled by barroom dark, so that again he was squinting against the glare, this time remembered rather than seen, as he nonetheless swayed over to a bar stool and ordered 1 clean shot of Arandis and a sweet tea from Speedy Sparks, then turned toward the jukebox below the stuffed buffalo head, removed a few coins from the small pocket of his leather vest and deposited them methodically in the slot, selecting Hank Williams' I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive, a Lefty Frizzell duet, and Lightnin' Hopkins' Mojo Hand. There were two men seated beside each other at the bar and a woman down the far end with red lipstick and red acrylics, smoking a Virginia Slim. John recognized one of them as Brick Bauer. He was another bartender at the saloon and was the kind of man who enjoyed being hard to get along with. Next to him was Doug Breedy, who liked to go down to Mexico looking for old jukeboxes and old Cadillacs, and who'd furnished the place with a Wurlitzer bought cheap in Laredo, the dim lights of which reflected now off the face of the guitar still hanging from John's back. He didn't know the woman. "Hi, Speedy," he said. "Hi there," said Speedy. "We know each other?" "It's John Bluebonnet," he said, cheeks flushing. "I'm tonight's act. Opener, anyway." "Far out. Welcome. First round's on us." Thank Thank you. Can I get me a guacamole too? I saw Ricky's car out there. "She's on break out back," said Speedy, wiping first the surface of the red oak bar top and then along the walnut-capped edge whose wood had been harvested from Howell's grandpa's farm up around Texarkana, and which Howell had brought to Soap Creek out of a kind of piety. All this John knew. He flung back the Arandas, ordered 2 more, and took the sweet tea with him out the front door and into the late afternoon, walking down to the elm grove at the edge of the lot to practice his licks before the show, alone and shaded from view. Shaded from sun, too, which nonetheless sparkled in the steel strings as they vibrated under his now slurred hand, slurred and steady as he practiced the songs he'd played first at open mic shows in Manhattan to little acclaim, and then here and there in dive bars further out than Fredericksburg to a few winos who some nights gratefully shed a tear, but more often asked him to play another Johnny Cash song instead, usually Long Black Veil, until yesterday when there'd been a last-minute cancellation at Soap Creek, and the owner, George Majewski, asked one of his bartenders if she knew anyone, and she asked had he ever heard of John Bluebonnet, and played him a tape. And it was only a Wednesday night anyway, so he agreed, and now John was here, half-drunk, chain-smoking Reds in an elm grove with a sweet tea, lifting his Stetson to wipe sweat from his brow and strumming his songs for no one as the sun set. Damn, it was hot. Even as the last light went and lightning bugs rose from the brambles to haunt the air with their sometimes light. But he kept that leather vest on his back and the hat on his head and his boots dug in that dirt at the base of the tree against which he was leaning. He kept playing until that lone star lit up on the barn wall. He didn't have a watch. He didn't keep time like that. When he returned, there were many more cars in the lot. Now he wasn't blinded when he walked through the door. The bar was just as dim as it had been at midday, maybe dimmer because there was more smoke and the heat of other men to thicken it. No one there knew John Bluebonnet, and so no one recognized him. He ordered another shot and a Corona and successfully procured a heap of guacamole, falling into a sort of half-dream as he attempted to envision the show he was about to play, until the first billiard balls popped against one another and struck pockets, rousing him from slumber. Soon all 3 of the tables were surrounded by men who, with their unkempt beards and half-glazed, almost pious absorption, resembled woodland priests scrying, leaning on wooden staffs, and John, sensing in himself a sudden flare of spirit, knowing it wouldn't last more than a minute, left his guitar to Speedy's safekeeping and joined their games. He won, too. Not every time, but often enough to attract the attention and curiosity of the revelers into whose midst he had strolled out of the April gloom. By the 5th or 6th round, they knew his name, and when he poured pop rocks into his beer and foam erupted from the neck, they all cheered. The woman with the red acrylics smiled and rolled her eyes. John tipped his hat, and she tilted her head at an empty bar stool. "Y'all take it easy," he said to the men, then turned and walked over to her. "I'm Cindy," she said, reaching out her hand. "You always this much of a fool?" "Well," said John, I'm about to go up on that stage. Now I'm going to take some water. Oh, also, side note, she is a bartender when she's not in her disguise at this same bar. Which is why there's been like some like moments of half recognition or whatever. The stage was on a raised platform littered with old Persian rugs in the back corner of the so-called dining room, what had originally been a stables when the place was a horse farm. The table stopped short for a dance floor at its fore. Behind it was a vaulted backdrop built from old barn wood, like an outsized shrine for a saintly statue, hung with neon signs advertising cold beer. John didn't need any amps, just the one microphone and a chair from one of the tables so he could sit while he played. Up on stage, the ceiling was so low you almost wanted to hunch as a precaution. Its thick and uneven stucco covered as if in hundreds of miniature stalactites, absorbing a dim glow from the lamps here and accumulating shadows there in an atmosphere almost archaic. The damp, cool air miraging with blue swirling smoke like some kind of limestone grotto, possessed of that timelessness and unreality which sometimes graces certain backwater chapels that seem in their crude and tumble-down grandeur to have simply risen out of the ground. Patrons filed one after another through the narrow door from the barroom where pool games continued uninterrupted, and men and women, in between foamy sips, made their first attempts at courtship. Few at first, and then more and more, taking their seats with half-glazed and swerving savor. No one had taken to the dance floor, but there would be time for that yet. John squinted out into the crowd. Behind the guitar, his hands were shaking. Every time someone flung open the door, there was a gust of noise. I can't promise you a barn burner, but I sure am pleased to be here tonight, he said, leaning forward tentatively into the microphone. His eyes were fixed on a stranger's steel-tipped boots. Some of you I met this very evening at the pool tables. This inspired a few cheers and the first curl of a smile under John's mustache. And some of you, he said, his eyes twinkling a little, I ain't never seen in my life. The first songs I ever heard were hymns. I thought they were written by God's own hand. My name is John Bluebonnet, and I've been making music since I learned otherwise. But my mother always told me, sing and play, Johnny, sing and play. No one's there to hear you talk. So why don't I get to it, he said, beginning to strum. The room was quieting now. I wrote this first one when I was laid up in a hospital out in Tucson, Arizona, sang it first for the whole ward and now for you, he said, closing his eyes, deepening so it seemed to Cindy, leaning against a wall by the girls' room, into a kind of fugue from which emerged a rich and ragged baritone, off kilter but somehow tuneful. Went rolling down this road alone, I never knew the way, spent too long wasted, wild and blue, same as I do today. Cross mountains high and valleys low, I walk with shadows near. How can I find my way back home when home's just what I fear? So won't you follow me down to water's edge? We'll sing praise to God in the riverbed, make our bodies wise on the electric sand, and the birds will sing in the promised land. The hospital had been psychiatric, but he hadn't wanted to say that. He'd written it one afternoon in the shower. There was no choice left but to sing because his ex-lover wouldn't pick up his calls. Singing is what a man does when the conversation is over. 10,000 miles I now have come and nowhere yet arrived. You've ravished every solid plan I'd ventured to contrive, and left me here with dust and wind and no companion more. I'll waste away my wandering days, no different than before. So won't you follow me down to water's edge? We'll sing praise to God in the riverbed. Make our bodies wise on the electric sand, and the birds will sing in the promised land. Opening his eyes for a moment, while his hands strummed the chords, John saw that man from Texaco standing in the back of the room by the bar door. He was scanning the crowd, looking for a woman who wasn't there. John knew who the man was looking for and knew why he couldn't find her. He hoped nonetheless the man liked the song. These 30 years I've listened close to voices in the wind, and I will go on listening until I reach my end. The secrets that they've shared with me, I never will forget. Love is just another name for human loneliness. The audience clapped and one or two whooped. Some left to refill their beers. The man from Texaco looked disappointed, but not in the music. Cindy was still waiting for the bathroom, and she was glad for it. She liked a man who didn't hide behind a band. She liked a man who didn't sing too well and knew it, who knew how to make a mystique out of his own defects. 2 Corinthians 12. John played another song, his own version of the folk ballad Moonshiner, which he started and finished while Cindy was in the bathroom fixing her lipstick and doing a pinch or two of blow off her own red nail. It wasn't hard to find blow at Soap Creek, but it was easy to lose it. Cindy, however, was not careless and had not once misplaced her quarry. In fact, she always placed it right where it belonged. On this occasion, she shared it with a woman next to her who looked like she needed it. Cindy ascertained from the look of her that her heart had lately been broken. After a line, the woman corroborated this fact, and indeed grew garrulous. But Cindy, not particularly interested in being backed into a corner, placed her forefinger on the stranger's lips. The gesture was simple and effective. The woman was quite surprised. Immediately, her talk ceased. Cindy said, "Honey, that man wasn't worth a dime, and you gave him $1. Keep some for yourself next time," then patted her cheek and exited the bathroom. After a couple more songs, John was talking again. He was saying, "Y'all ever heard of a man named Arthur Dallas Stanger? He's the wild bastard who peppered the Westlake Hills with houses, sleek modern numbers in a manner alike to Frank Lloyd Wright. Anyway, he loved hunting big game, as that sort of man does, but nothing interested him more than the prospect of roping a polar bear. So he chartered a plane out to Norway and did just that. In fact, he took a little wooden boat out among the ice floes and saw one paddling by at a stone's throw, whence he lassoed the poor thing right around the neck. Almost flipped the boat. Well, the bear started swimming for him, not one to be provoked, and AD whipped out a Sharp's carbine and shot her in the head. But that wasn't enough for him, nor was stuffing her and fixing her rampant in his foyer. The man wanted to make a movie. So he bought a saddled brown bear from a carnival with her teeth all rotted out from candy and provoked her into loping through the brush, chased by I don't remember if he was a one-eyed or one-armed cowboy named Hackberry Johnson. I'm sure that's not what his mother called him. But Hackberry was the lasso man, and one of AD's buddies was filming all the while on an 8mm rigged to a cart on a line of railroad track they'd built in the Westlake Valley. Of course, the bear was none too pleased and got hold somehow of Hackberry's leg, which cut short the shoot because they had to haul him up the hill to the house of a doctor who said, "He's going to be all right, but it's the worst case of bear gumming I ever saw." Cindy laughed at this, and a few men at one of the tables guffawed. Then John said, "There ain't nothing stranger or more dangerous than a man with loose change and an idea." That's the subject of my next song. All in all, the gig was a success. Those were years when songwriters were more welcome in Houston than Austin, but John's set ran not a minute longer than 40 and was a fine palate cleanser after the heat of the day. The crowd at Soap Creek wasn't one to drive a hard bargain, especially when they knew there'd be a second show with a slide guitar and a fiddle ere long. There would be time then for dancing. but John Bluebonnet would already be gone. In fact, he was halfway out the door with his guitar on his back when a red acrylic-tipped hand caught him by his sleeve. "Hey, cowboy," said Cindy, swaying a little. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I've got to go home and feed my cat," said John. Cindy just looked at him. He cleared his throat. "She'll have commenced crying by now," he mumbled into his mustache. "Well," she said, "let me walk you to your car at least." Cindy had long, sloping lashes which shaded her eyes. These she blinked slowly as she spoke. There was a freckle dead center in her cleavage that exuded an almost irresistible charm. This was just visible above the fringe of her iridescent green corset. What demanded his attention most of all, however, was a pink scar of mysterious provenance, probably 2 inches long, on the upper curve of her right tit. She saw him looking at it. "Balance of a knife fight," she said. John was inclined somehow to believe her. She put her arm through his and led him off the porch. "There's something about you just ain't like other guys," she said. "Shoot," he said. "Ain't no one like another." She studied his face. "Something delicate," she said. "Maybe it was the way you plucked the strings. I could feel it in your music." He climbed into his truck and turned on the ignition. She leaned against the open door. "You got a pen?" she said. "I do," he said. "Well, a magic marker." "Give me your arm," she said. "How about this?" he said, handing her the Texaco receipt from his vest pocket. She wrote her number on it. "Don't call after 6 or before 10, she said. He took off down the road, speeding back toward Spicewood. He had wanted to kiss her. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming. If you're online, please donate and come back next week. It's going to be, who is it? Saray Jarrell Johnson and Eric Sneathan, and it's going to be incredible. Oh, and Eric lives in the Bay and is coming, so you should definitely come.